So you'd have to be living under a rock to be unaware of this latest and maybe last big wave of news regarding From Software's Elden Ring. And if you have been, well, congratulations. I'd recommend you crawl back under there and stay warm and dry and oblivious until February 25th. Now, I played Elden Ring's network test and shared my thoughts about that experience here on my channel, but that's because the test was official. It was something that Hidetaka Miyazaki and his team felt comfortable showcasing as of November 2021, so I in turn felt comfortable participating because I knew it would be fun and it wouldn't ultimately, for me, ruin the game or the many surprises that come with the first playthrough. But since then, the network test has been somewhat predictably jailbroken, the character creator and various bits of out-of-bounds content have been passed around social media, game journalists, always desperate for clicks, have certainly joined the circus. Game Informer in particular has been pumping out a lot of content, and I think actually spoiling more details than most fans want at this point. Miyazaki, in his January 28th interview with the official PlayStation blog, even said, quote, "If possible, we want players to try and steer clear of spoilers or guides and go in with a completely fresh, open mind and enjoy that initial sense of adventure. That's how we'd want to experience the game if we were going into it for the first time." End quote. Look, the lead up to Dark Souls 3 was ridiculous. The hype and curiosity around Sekiro was off the charts. But this is as wacky as any lead up to any FromSoft game to date, in my opinion, as someone who's been following the studio since 2011. But I do have a sort of glass half full outlook on this craziness, and it's for a specific reason. From Software's best known qualities are 1. Creating challenging and hugely influential action RPGs, and 2. Being exceptionally enigmatic. They don't have a transparent open door policy like a lot of other studios do. They operate amid a fog of mystery, one that I suspect the team members are well aware of at this point and almost perpetuate. This fog is in part what has made Miyazaki such a legendary game designer, and I've always loved it. To me, this is a telltale sign of true artistry. One of my favorite interview moments of all time plays out in a 1997 conversation between Charlie Rose and filmmaker David Lynch. Stick with me here. Rose plainly asks Lynch what his new film Lost Highway is quote-unquote about, meaning plot, story beats, etc. Lynch stammers before coyly smiling at Rose and saying, "Charlie," in a way that makes you feel like he's scolding Rose for not knowing better and asking such a silly journalisty question. And Lynch does this because whatever Lost Highway is about is likely too thematically and aesthetically complex to be simply communicated in a few words, a few sentences. That's why Lynch made the film. That's why it exists. You have to experience it yourself to answer those questions. And even then, different people are going to draw different conclusions. In my mind, that's artistry in a nutshell. That's what the creative process is all about. And although we're talking about different mediums here, I myself do see parallels between someone like Lynch and someone like Miyazaki. That being said, every couple years when Miyazaki or Kitao emerge from their secluded lab and probably at the behest of their publisher speak up and share some insight into how they work, how they arrive at various creative and design related decisions, I listen because it's fascinating to have even a small window through which we can glimpse their creative process. Even knowing all the while that the true answers we seek could never be conveyed in an interview and only understood in the moment, controller in hand, eyes glued to the screen. So this is why I've sifted through most of the new information surrounding Elden Ring and extracted 9 new takeaways I found most interesting as an admirer of this studio and its work. Again, I think of these less as news headlines and more as creative insights. I don't really do news per se here on the channel. This is more of an opportunity to just analyze the mechanical and design related decisions that the team at this studio has made, to better understand the studio's process and outlook during this game's development. That's what interests me most. And there's no serious spoilers to follow. I'm mostly pulling from Yasuhiro Kitao's recent interview at the Taipei Game Show and Hidetaka Miyazaki's recent interviews with Edge magazine and the official PlayStation blog. And I'm also sharing 7 additional takeaways for a total of 16 in a second follow-up video exclusively for my patrons on Patreon. All of my patrons, regardless of tier, will have access to that second video. And if you enjoy my content, Patreon is indeed the best way to further support what I do, but it's also a way to unlock a lot more content from me each and every month, including my Patreon exclusive podcast, my Patreon exclusive newsletter, early video previews, perks within my Discord server, and more. So links to my Patreon page, my Discord server, my social media accounts, all of that stuff can be found down in the video description. But let's get into it. My 9 biggest takeaways from the new From Software interviews about Elden Ring. Number 1. Elden Ring is Miyazaki's dream game, according to Miyazaki himself. We've heard Miyazaki speak about his love of Bloodborne, his love of Dark Souls 3. Demon Souls was obviously a key turning point in his career. The popularity of Dark Souls clearly catapulted From Software and Miyazaki to a much larger stage, and he finally received some much-deserved critical recognition with Sekiro. But in Jason Killingsworth's new Edge interview, Miyazaki speaks pretty definitively about what Elden Ring represents for him and for the studio. He's candid about how Elden Ring has benefited from the games that came before it, how they as a team of game designers have knowledge now that they didn't have when they were going into the development of Dark Souls or Bloodborne. He refers to Elden Ring as a, quote, culmination of experience, end quote, which he says makes it their best game to date. As modest and humble and quirky as Miyazaki is, I sense a real confidence in his language from these recent interviews. Even Kitao said in his Taipei Game Show interview that he is, quote, confident that Elden Ring will prove to be an unforgettable gaming experience, end quote. But more specifically, check out this train of thought from Miyazaki. Quote, if I was in the mood to play a game, or if I had an ideal game world, Elden Ring gets pretty close to that. I create the games that are my type. Tight combat, fantasy, medieval settings with dungeons to explore, and things like that. That's just what I'm into. And so Elden Ring is really hitting all the right notes there. End quote. He also adds that obviously beyond playtesting, he doesn't play his own games in any traditional sense. That he just can't bring himself to do it or to enjoy the experience because he, as the creator, has an entirely different relationship with these games than we, the consumers, do. But in the Edge interview, he does reiterate that, quote, if I did play games I created, then this would be close to the ideal game I'd want, end quote. Number 2, according to Kitao, it is not possible to reach 100% completion in a single playthrough of Elden Ring due to branching paths toward the end of the game. In his Taipei Game Show interview, Kitao plainly states that it's impossible to experience everything the game has to offer in a single playthrough, and to see every bit of content, players will need to make different decisions as they progress through the game's New Game Plus cycles, particularly toward the end of each cycle. This immediately made me think of Sekiro. There's always been optional bosses in Soulsborne games, but Sekiro more than ever before gated certain bosses and endings and cutscenes among several distinct paths. For example, players can reach the game's Shura ending much faster than the Purification ending, and both endings feature different final bosses and ultimately different final chapters to Wolf and Kuro's story. And I really like that about the game, so it sounds like we can expect a similar approach in Elden Ring, and if what Kitao has said about the story is true, these branching paths will be even more impressive than those featured in Sekiro or any previous game. Number 3, the game's bright color palette was a deliberate lore or storytelling related decision. FromSoft games are sometimes thought of as exclusively being dank and dark, and there's a thread of truth to that. But all of the Soulsborne titles have featured lots of interesting, bold colors, some more than others. Even Bloodborne isn't an exception. And some people have looked at images of the game's Limgrave region and thought, okay, they're obviously pivoting and trying something different, or they're super inspired by Breath of the Wild or whatever. But in Miyazaki's interview with Tim Turry on the official PlayStation blog, he explains that they didn't simply make Elden Ring brighter for the sake of it being brighter. Here's Miyazaki on the topic. Quote, giving it a splash of color was necessary this time, particularly considering Elden Ring has a vast open world to explore. We wanted to give a sense that a golden age has passed through this world and that the player can still see traces of it. We wanted to provide the world with a much more painterly look to invoke a high fantasy feeling as a theme. End quote. This is interesting and lines up with what we understand about the game's lore at this point. That unlike the world of Dark Souls, which was a sick, fading, dying world, the world of Elden Ring, at least when we first visit it with our player character, is much closer comparatively to its glory days. Colors alone are being used to get that point across. Number 4, in the Edge interview, Miyazaki was very dodgy when asked about the role of water and the ocean. If you watched my network test recap, you know that the role of water in Elden Ring was one of my biggest questions about the game. I was kind of shocked when I ran down to the beach with my player character and hopped into the water only to fall to my death, especially coming off Sekiro where there's a straightforward swimming mechanic. Now look, if we can't swim at all in Elden Ring, that's fine. There's so much to do on solid ground, there's really nothing to complain about here. But it is curious that water surrounds so much of the game's world map. In almost any direction you look, there's water. And it's certainly pretty, it adds to the vibe, to the atmosphere, and that alone is worth something. But it makes you wonder, will we unlock some kind of water traversal ability later in the game? Will we venture into some underwater Atlantis-y level at some point during our playthrough? Well, when Edge asked Miyazaki about what appears to be kraken-like tentacles on Godfrey's axe as depicted in this official image, when they asked about what that means and if Godfrey has some connection to the ocean or if we'll venture into the ocean in the game, here's Miyazaki's rather political response. Quote, "What I will say is that he's a character with a major presence in the story, and he represents not only a great part of the player character's role, but also a large part of the world and its history." And so, without spoiling too much, I just want to say, as a character that represents so much of the game, he's definitely one who I find very appealing and attractive in that sense. End quote. So the fact that Miyazaki doesn't simply roll out some kind of swimming mechanic or ocean level tempts me to believe that one or both are indeed present in the game. Number 5. On the topic of Godfrey, Miyazaki in his Edge interview confirmed that Godfrey was one of the first Elden Lords. And here's his full explanation. Quote, "One of the motivations of the player character in Elden Ring is to become Elden Lord. They're to journey to the lands between and become the next Elden Lord. In the sort of heyday of the Golden Order of the Lands Between, there were 2 Elden Lords, and Godfrey was the first of these. He was the very first Elden Lord and was married to Eternal Queen Marika, who has been detailed in some of the lore we've released publicly so far. And he was representative of this period of grandeur and affluence. He represents everything great about the Elden Ring and the Lands Between at that time. Eventually, he was exiled from the Lands Between. He himself became tarnished, and he shares this deep connection with the Tarnished, the player character. Godfrey is an embodiment of their long history and struggle. He represents a lot of what the player character stands for, and he symbolizes a deep connection with the player, something that used to shine brilliantly and now has become tarnished and fallen from grace." End quote. That's a lot of insight, and I'm going to allow you to decide for yourself what it all means. Is our player character related to Godfrey? Why was he banished? Did he do something wrong? Was he betrayed? Is Marika corrupted? And what does all of this have to do with the ocean? Number 6. In his Taipei Game Show interview, Kitao confirmed that the team has taken critical feedback from the closed network test into consideration, but it remains to be seen if that includes performance-related feedback. Kitao said the primary changes to the final product when compared to the network test include revised and finalized flavor text, such as item descriptions, the inclusion of additional NPCs, and changes to some enemy placements, which he emphasized is one of the trickiest things to get right in any game, particularly a game as wide and open as Elden Ring. And I appreciate all of those little details, especially his comments regarding smart enemy placement. But I did realize that neither he nor Miyazaki made any performance-related remarks. Kitao mentioned that the game will utilize the PlayStation 5 controller's haptic feedback function, but that's the extent of it. And if you watched my network test recap, you know that this was likely my biggest complaint about the experience. There were pop-in and LOD issues that at times I did find distracting. Now look, I happily enjoyed playing DS1 on my Xbox 360 back in late 2011, and that version of the game struggled to hit 30 FPS at 720p, so I know I will have a blast with Elden Ring, whether its performance is perfect or imperfect. I still adore Bloodborne to this day despite the fact that it runs at 30 FPS and 1080p. These games are so special, so engaging, that I find I'm able to overlook technical shortcomings that would hinder my experience with other games. But it's 2022, and my suspicion is that FromSoft's performance targets are simply unrealistic. For example, on PS5, the network test performance mode was attempting to hit 60 FPS at a dynamic 1800p, and both targets felt slightly out of reach. There were occasional frame drops, I'd guess mostly in the 50 to 55 FPS range, and the game was clearly struggling to maintain that 1800p target as I zipped around the fields on my mount. There's a sense that the world is often struggling to load around you, trees popping in, fields populating with grass, that kind of stuff. I personally value frame rate over resolution, especially in fast-paced action games like the ones FromSoft creates, so I'd be more than content with 60 FPS at 1440p, let's say, if that lower pixel count reduced pop-in and stabilized the frame rate. Of course, modern games are complicated and there could be a lot more going on under the hood that's causing the stutters and pop-in issues. This might not be an easy fix and we might just get what we get, and that's not the end of the world. Kitao did confirm that the team is hard at work on the game's day one patch, and hopefully at least some of these technical wrinkles will be ironed out by then. Number 7. You can skip Stormveil Castle, the game's first legacy dungeon, and its bosses at the beginning of a new playthrough, and venture to other regions outside Limgrave. I was pretty surprised to hear Kitao say this in his Taipei Game Show interview. Here's his full quote. Quote, "While not all areas are immediately accessible from the start, it is possible to travel to a number of different regions. Naturally, some of these areas are designed for later exploration, so it's possible that players who travel there prematurely may end up suffering and come slinking back. The game is fundamentally designed to provide freedom of choice, and this includes the order in which the varied areas are explored. In the closed network test, players started from Limgrave, then moved to the legacy dungeon Stormveil. After making their way through Stormveil, they would then battle the boss character Margit, but it is possible to skip this whole area and head on to a different region. In the released version, you will be able to. So if you find one area a little difficult, you can decide to head elsewhere first, before returning after you have leveled up a few times." End quote. These comments are inherently interesting, but they made me, as a speedrunner of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, to think about the implications for speedrunning. It makes me wonder, in a mandatory boss run, would there be any advantages to heading off to another region and other bosses before knocking out Margit and Stormveil? It's hard to say, because we obviously don't know much about what lies beyond. But I'm sure those looking to speedrun Elden Ring will be off trying some wacky stuff in the first few weeks following the game's release. Myself, I think I've settled on having a deliberately slow and casual first playthrough. I don't want to force anything. I want to create a cool character and take my time combing through Limgrave just like I did in the network test. I want to learn and enjoy the game first, and in my mind, there will be plenty of time for competitiveness and challenge runs later. Number 8. According to Kitao, there are a lot of NPCs in Elden Ring, and conversations with those NPCs will go a long way toward shaping our worldview within the game. During the Q&A portion of his Taipei Game Show appearance, Kitao was asked if Elden Ring would feature as many cutscenes as Sekiro. And Kitao somewhat downplayed Sekiro's number of cutscenes, and I think I understand where he's coming from. It does feel like Sekiro had a lot more in-game story moments than it actually did, but as he noted, most of those movies preceded boss battles, as they have in all previous Soulsborne games, and of course, some came at the beginning and ending of the game, as they do in the other games as well. I think the real difference with Sekiro is that its characters and conflicts aren't quite as obtuse as, let's say, Bloodborne's. But Kitao, with this question, chose to redirect the focus to the role of Elden Ring's NPCs, and I'll just read his full quote here. Quote, "There are a lot of NPCs in this title as well. There is also a location in the game known as the Round Table Hold, where several NPCs gather and can be talked to. Conversations in these sorts of locations, which naturally all tie into the game's own overarching story, should provide a lot of enjoyment themselves. And this ties into what I talked about before, in that these NPCs all have their own relationships with the world of Elden Ring. And rather than make the main storyline explicit through text, we felt it was more entertaining and edifying for the player to provide key information via the spoken lines of these characters." End quote. Now, this doesn't sound atypical for a From Software game. Just think about Firelink Shrine from DS3, a place where NPCs like Henri, Igon, Carla, Ludlith, Hawkwood, and many more gather. You can learn a lot about the game's world from these characters, and they certainly have their own worldviews, their own spins on what's right and wrong, what matters and what doesn't, if anything. But listen to how Kitao plays up what's on offer this time around. Quote, "I'd say this is probably the richest and most detailed world we have ever created. It's certainly something to look forward to savoring." End quote. And then he continues, quote, "As was the case in our previous titles, we have striven to create a game in which the player's own actions form the basis of the story. Rather than using movies and cutscenes to explicitly inform the player of the storyline, we have tried instead to provide the player with small fragments and let them use their own imagination to construct the story. We have been very careful to ensure that the story retains mystery and that our users have a chance to imagine what might be happening. Users who enjoyed these elements in our previous titles should find even more volume in this title to satisfy the desire to piece together the story themselves. As well as providing leeway for players to use their own imaginations, the story is our most absorbing and immersive one yet." End quote. I'm loving what I'm hearing. Simple as that. And number 9, I had to include this one. There's a chance you've already seen or heard the quote, but Miyazaki told Game Informer himself that he is, quote, "rediscovered his love of creating poison swamps," end quote, during the development of Elden Ring. So look, again, unless you're living under a rock, you're well aware of the fact that there's a pattern of challenging swamp areas throughout the Soulsborne games. And you're also probably aware that this has led to no shortage of memes about how Miyazaki is just a masochistic game designer who can't help himself. But here's what Miyazaki himself told Daniel Tack in a January 28th published article on GameInformer.com. And by the way, Tack and his colleagues have been the leaders of the new Elden Ring spoiler campaign, so unless you want to know specific details earlier than expected, don't go Googling Daniel Tack and Game Informer and Elden Ring and all of those keywords. But here's the safe quote. Quote, "In terms of how the player feels when they encounter this area is a different story. But when making the game, I rediscovered my love for making poison swamps. I know how people feel about them, but suddenly I realize I'm just in the middle of making one and I just can't help myself. It just happens." End quote. Miyazaki continues and actually shares a pretty interesting detail here. Quote, "In terms of Elden Ring's story and setting, there is something that is especially horrible that exists and persists in this world. I'll go ahead and say the name so it's something you can look forward to. It's called the Scarlet Rot. This is something that is separate a little bit from poison or toxicity, but I hope you look forward to it." End quote. Now, the details about Scarlet Rot are very intriguing. That term instantly makes me think back to Dragon Rot from Sekiro. We'll have to see what kind of role this disease or status effect plays in the game, but let's walk this back a little. I tweeted about this the other day, but I can't help but picture Miyazaki at his office computer, smiling as he places enemies in a shallow lake of sludge. I mean, this guy is just who we thought he was. It's hysterical, it's adorable, it's the most Miyazaki quote of all time, and I know I'm gonna laugh out loud myself the first time I stumble into what is clearly one of Miyazaki's new and beloved poison swamps, which are always unique in terms of level design. Some people detest these levels, but I always thought they were pretty clever. From Blight Town to Farron Keep to the Swamp of Sorrow, these levels present interesting puzzles, a high difficulty level due to enemy placement, enemy variety, the obvious environmental hazards. They're a unique FromSoft staple. And I don't think Elden Ring would feel right if it didn't have at least one of these places. But that's it. Those are my 9 main takeaways from the recent From Software interviews. I'm certainly curious to hear what you think about these insights down in the comments. And remember, if you're interested, I'll be sharing a second video exclusively on Patreon in the next couple days with 7 additional takeaways, just continuing this discussion and picking up where I left off here. So thank you as always for watching. Good luck keeping it together over these next several weeks, and I will catch you next time.